3 professional trainers had left Bellamy Ranch in ambulances after attempting to work with Thunder, and the 17-hand stallion was scheduled for euthanasia in 7 days. James Sullivan, a homeless veteran who had been sleeping on library benches just weeks before, walked up to the reinforced fence and looked directly into the eyes of the horse everyone called a killer. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust swirled in thick clouds across the rodeo grounds as another handler was thrown against the metal fence, his body hitting the rails with a sickening thud that echoed across the arena. The massive gray stallion reared up on his hind legs, his eyes wild with fury, nostrils flaring as he released a piercing whinny that sent shivers down the spines of everyone watching. This was Thunder, a name that fit him perfectly, not just for the sound of his hooves against the earth, but for the storm of rage that seemed to live inside him. Marcus Bellamy, the owner of Bellamy Ranch and one of the wealthiest horse breeders in the county, stood outside the corral with his arms crossed, his face a mask of frustration and barely contained anger. He had purchased Thunder 2 years ago from a bankrupt racing stable, paying top dollar for what was supposed to be a champion bloodline. The horse's pedigree was impeccable, descended from Triple Crown winners and European champions. On paper, Thunder should have been worth his weight in gold. In reality, he had become Marcus's most expensive mistake. The animal was magnificent. There was no denying that. Standing at 17 hands high with a coat that shimmered like molten silver in the sunlight, Thunder possessed the kind of beauty that stopped people in their tracks. His muscular frame spoke of power and speed, the kind of raw athletic ability that could make fortunes on the racetrack or in the show ring. But all that potential meant nothing when the horse was too dangerous to handle, too violent to train, too aggressive to be anywhere near other animals or people. Marcus had tried everything. He had brought in the best trainers money could buy, men with decades of experience who had worked with everything from wild mustangs to troubled thoroughbreds. Each one had left the ranch defeated, some with injuries, all with the same assessment that Thunder was beyond help. The horse had been labeled untrainable, dangerous, a lost cause. Some had suggested he be put down, that it was the humane thing to do before someone got seriously hurt or killed. But Marcus was a stubborn man, and putting down a horse that had cost him nearly $500,000 was not something he was willing to do. Instead, Thunder lived in isolation in a reinforced paddock at the far end of the ranch, away from the other horses, away from the daily operations. Food was thrown over the fence, water troughs filled from a safe distance. No one went inside with him anymore, not after the incidents. Not after Thunder had broken a trainer's arm in 3 places, sent another to the hospital with fractured ribs, and nearly killed a stable hand who had made the mistake of trying to corner him with a rope. The townspeople knew about Thunder. Stories spread about the killer horse at Bellamy Ranch, the beautiful monster that no one could tame. Parents warned their children to stay away from that part of the property. Ranch hands drew straws to see who would have to feed him, and the loser approached with trembling hands and racing hearts. Thunder had become a legend of sorts, a cautionary tale about the dangers of breaking an animal's spirit, though no one knew exactly what had broken Thunder in the first place. What Marcus didn't know, what no one at the ranch understood, was that Thunder's aggression wasn't random violence or innate cruelty. The horse had known kindness once, had known gentle hands and soft words, but he had also known betrayal, abandonment, and abuse that left scars deeper than any whip could create. Somewhere in the darkness of his past, Thunder had learned that humans meant pain, that trust led to suffering, and that the only way to survive was to fight, to never let anyone close enough to hurt him again. The memories haunted him in ways that horses remember, through instinct and sensation rather than clear images. The smell of leather still triggered something primal in him, a memory of being beaten until he could barely stand. The sound of raised voices sent him into a panic that manifested as rage. The approach of a human with a rope meant being tied so tightly he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't escape whatever torment was coming next. So Thunder fought, because fighting was all he had left. In the small town of Riverside, about 15 miles from Bellamy Ranch, another story was unfolding in the shadows that most people chose not to see. James Sullivan, 42 years old and once a decorated Army sergeant, sat on a bench outside the public library with all his worldly possessions in a worn military duffel bag beside him. His clothes were clean, thanks to the shelter where he sometimes stayed, but they hung loose on a frame that had once been solid muscle and was now lean from irregular meals and the kind of stress that ate away at a person from the inside. James had been homeless for 8 months ever since the combination of PTSD, nightmares, and memories he couldn't escape had cost him his job, then his apartment, then his dignity. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, had led men through impossible situations, had made decisions that saved lives and haunted him in equal measure. He had come home to a country that thanked him for his service with words, but offered little else, to a VA system so overwhelmed that getting help meant waiting lists and bureaucracy and forms that seemed designed to make veterans give up. The nightmares were the worst part. James would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, his heart racing as his mind convinced him he was back in Kandahar, back in the firefight that had killed 3 of his men while he survived. The sounds of the city at night became gunfire in his dreams. Car backfires sent him diving for cover. Crowds made his skin crawl with anxiety, made him feel trapped and exposed all at once. He had tried to explain it to employers, to landlords, to the few friends who had stuck around for a while, but understanding only went so far. When you couldn't hold down a job, couldn't afford rent, couldn't function in the normal world that everyone else seemed to navigate so easily. So James drifted, moving between the shelter when they had space, the library during the day where it was warm and safe, and no one bothered him if he kept quiet, and the streets when there was nowhere else to go. He had learned the rhythm of homelessness, the unspoken rules, the places to avoid, and the places where someone might offer a meal or a kind word. He had his pride still, refused to beg, picked up odd jobs when he could find them. But each day was a battle, and some days James wasn't sure why he kept fighting. What kept him going, what got him out of his sleeping bag each morning, was a promise he had made to himself and to the men he had lost. He would survive. He would find a way back. He wouldn't let the war win by destroying him after he had made it home alive. It was a small thing, but it was enough to put one foot in front of the other, to face another day in a world that seemed to have no place for broken soldiers or their invisible wounds. Neither Thunder nor James knew it yet, but their paths were about to cross in a way that would change both of their lives forever, that would prove that sometimes the most broken souls are the ones best equipped to heal each other, and that redemption can come from the most unexpected places. The decision came on a Tuesday morning when Marcus Bellamy stood in his ranch office, staring at the financial reports spread across his mahogany desk. The numbers didn't lie, and they told a story he didn't want to accept. Thunder was costing him a fortune in specialized fencing, increased insurance premiums, hazard pay for the few workers willing to go near that paddock, and worst of all, the opportunity cost of what that space and those resources could be generating if they were used for horses that could actually be trained and sold. His ranch manager, Carl Henderson, a weathered man in his 60s who had been working with horses longer than Marcus had been alive, stood across from him with a grim expression. Carl had survived the Great Depression as a child, had worked his way up from nothing, and didn't waste words on things that didn't need saying. But this needed saying. "Marcus, we can't keep doing this. That horse is a liability we can't afford." Carl's voice was steady but firm. "He's dangerous. He's costing us money, and he's taking up resources we need for the animals that actually have a future. You know what needs to be done." Marcus ran his hand through his graying hair, feeling every one of his 53 years pressing down on him. He knew Carl was right. From a business standpoint, there was only one logical solution, but the thought of putting Thunder down felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that he had wasted $500,000 on a lost cause, like accepting that some things couldn't be fixed with money and determination. "Give me a week," Marcus said finally. "One more week to find an alternative. If I can't find someone willing to take him, then we'll make the call." Carl nodded slowly, understanding that this was as much about Marcus's pride as it was about the horse, but also knowing that a week wouldn't change anything. Thunder had exhausted every option, burned every bridge. There was nowhere left to turn. That same Tuesday morning, James woke up on a bench in Riverside Park, his body stiff from sleeping on wood, his breath visible in the cold autumn air. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful if James had the energy to appreciate them. Instead, he folded his sleeping bag with practiced efficiency, tucked it into his duffel, and began the walk to the community center where they served breakfast to anyone who needed it. The line was already forming when he arrived, a mix of familiar faces and new ones, each person carrying their own story of how they had ended up here. James recognized Tommy, an older man who had lost his construction job when his back gave out. There was Maria, a single mother whose medical bills from her daughter's illness had bankrupted her. A younger guy James didn't know, probably fresh to the streets, still had that look of shock and disbelief that this was his life now. They didn't talk much while waiting. There was an unspoken understanding among them, a respect for each other's privacy and dignity. They were all just trying to survive another day, to fill their stomachs with enough food to keep going, to find enough warmth to make it through another night. The volunteers who served the meals were kind, never judgmental, and James was grateful for that small mercy. After breakfast, James walked to the library as he did most mornings. It was his sanctuary, a place where being homeless didn't matter, as long as you were quiet and respectful. He had discovered the computer lab, where he could search for jobs, fill out applications, try to maintain some connection to the world that had left him behind. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, a gentle woman in her 70s who reminded James of his grandmother, always greeted him with a smile and sometimes slipped him a sandwich from her lunch. On this particular morning, James was scrolling through job listings with diminishing hope when he overheard a conversation at the desk. Mrs. Chen was talking to someone on the phone, her voice filled with concern. "Yes, I understand it's difficult, but surely there must be someone who can help." She paused, listening. A horse behaviorist? I didn't even know that was a thing. Another pause. That expensive? Oh my. James's ears perked up despite himself. He had grown up around horses, had spent his childhood summers on his uncle's small farm in Kentucky. It felt like a lifetime ago, those memories of simpler times, when his biggest worry was whether he could convince his uncle to let him ride the mare bareback through the fields. He had been good with horses once, had an instinct for understanding them that his uncle said was rare. When Mrs. Chen hung up, James found himself walking over to the desk before he could talk himself out of it. "Excuse me," he said quietly, not wanting to intrude, but unable to ignore the pull of curiosity. "I couldn't help but overhear. Is someone having trouble with a horse?" Mrs. Chen looked up, her expression softening when she saw James. "Oh yes, that was my nephew, Marcus Bellamy. He owns a ranch outside town and has a horse that's apparently quite dangerous. He's tried everything, spent a fortune on trainers, but nothing has worked." She shook her head sadly. "Between you and me, I think he's going to have the poor animal put down. He's running out of options." James felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in months. It might have been hope or purpose, or just the memory of who he used to be before the war took that person away. "I used to work with horses," he heard himself say, "before I enlisted. I wasn't a professional or anything, but I had a way with them. Difficult ones especially. Mrs. Chen studied him for a long moment, and James saw the wheels turning in her mind. She knew his situation, had never asked him directly, but had probably pieced it together from the fact that he was there every day, that he washed up in the bathroom, that he sometimes dozed off in the quiet corners when he thought no one was watching. "Would you be interested in trying?" she asked carefully. "I should warn you, from what Marcus described, this horse sounds truly dangerous. Several people have been injured." James thought about it for all of 3 seconds. What did he have to lose? His pride was already gone. His dignity was a thing he performed each day by shaving in public restrooms and keeping his clothes as clean as possible. His future was uncertain whether he took this chance or not. But the possibility of doing something meaningful, of using skills he thought he'd lost, of maybe saving an animal that everyone else had given up on, that was worth the risk. "I'd like to try," James said firmly, his voice carrying a strength that surprised even him. "If your nephew is willing to let me, I'd like to meet this horse." Mrs. Chen smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and made James remember what it felt like to have someone believe in him. "Let me call Marcus back," she said, reaching for the phone. "I can't promise anything, but I'll do my best to convince him." As she dialed, James felt his heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with anxiety or fear. For the first time in 8 months, he felt something that resembled hope, a fragile thing that could shatter easily but was there nonetheless. He didn't know if Marcus would agree to let a homeless veteran near his expensive problem horse. He didn't know if he still had whatever gift he'd once possessed for understanding these magnificent animals, but he knew he had to try, because sometimes the only way forward is to reach for something, anything, that reminds you of who you used to be before life broke you down. The conversation between Mrs. Chen and Marcus lasted nearly 20 minutes, and James could only hear one side of it, but he could tell from her patient tone and gentle persistence that she was working hard to convince her nephew. She mentioned James's background with horses multiple times, carefully omitting his current living situation at first, though James suspected that detail would come up eventually. When she finally hung up, her expression was cautiously optimistic. "He's willing to meet with you," she said, writing down an address on a piece of paper. "Tomorrow morning at 8. He was hesitant at first, but I reminded him that he's out of options and that sometimes unconventional solutions are the only ones left." She paused, looking at James with kind but serious eyes. "I should tell you, I mentioned that you're going through a difficult time right now. I hope that was okay." I thought honesty was better than having him find out later. James nodded, appreciating her directness even as he felt a familiar flush of shame. It was one thing to be homeless among others in the same situation, another entirely to have it known by people who had homes and jobs and normal lives. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me this chance. I know you didn't have to." Mrs. Chen reached across the desk and patted his hand briefly. "My late husband was a veteran," she said softly. "Korea. He came home different, struggled with things people didn't talk about back then. I know it's not easy what you've been through. Just promise me you'll be careful with that horse. Marcus said he's truly dangerous." That night James couldn't sleep, which was nothing new. But this time it was anticipation rather than nightmares keeping him awake. He lay in his sleeping bag in an alcove behind the community center, staring up at the stars and thinking about the next morning. He remembered his uncle's words from years ago that horses could sense fear and uncertainty, that they responded to calmness and confidence. He would need to find those qualities within himself, qualities that felt buried under months of survival mode and self-doubt. As dawn broke, James used the last of his money to buy a cup of coffee at the gas station, then spent extra time in their bathroom making himself as presentable as possible. He shaved carefully, combed his hair, made sure his clothes were neat even if they were worn. First impressions mattered, and he needed Marcus to see someone capable, not just another charity case. The walk to Bellamy Ranch took nearly 2 hours, but James arrived 15 minutes early, his duffel bag on his shoulder because he had nowhere else to leave it. The ranch was impressive, sprawling acres of pristine white fencing, immaculate barns, and horses grazing in fields that looked like they belonged in a painting. Everything spoke of wealth and success, and James felt his confidence waver as he approached the main house. Marcus met him on the porch, and James could immediately read the skepticism in the man's face. Marcus was well-dressed in boots and jeans that probably cost more than James had spent on clothes in the last year. His posture, that of someone used to being in charge. He looked James up and down, taking in the duffel bag, the worn jacket, the military bearing that James couldn't quite shake even after everything. "You must be James Sullivan," Marcus said, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "My aunt speaks highly of you, though I'll be honest, I'm not sure what you think you can accomplish that professional trainers couldn't." James met his eyes steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "I can't promise anything," he said, "but I grew up around horses, worked with some difficult ones on my uncle's farm. Sometimes animals that have been hurt or traumatized respond better to someone who understands what that's like." There was a flicker of something in Marcus's expression, maybe recognition or curiosity. He gestured toward a utility vehicle parked nearby. "Come on then, I'll take you to meet Thunder. But I'm warning you now, don't get too close to the fence. He's put 3 men in the hospital, and I don't need another lawsuit or another person getting hurt on my property." They drove in silence across the ranch, past the main stables and training areas, out to the far reaches of the property where the land became rougher and less manicured. Finally, they reached a paddock that looked more like a prison than a home for a horse. The fencing was reinforced steel, taller than standard, with warning signs posted every few feet. And inside that fortress, James saw Thunder for the first time. The horse was magnificent even from a distance. His gray coat caught the morning light like liquid silver, and his size was imposing, easily 17 hands of pure muscle and power. But what struck James most was the look in Thunder's eyes when the horse noticed their approach. It wasn't just aggression or wildness. It was fear masked as fury, pain disguised as violence. James recognized that look because he had seen it in the mirror often enough during his worst nights. Thunder paced along the far fence line, his movements agitated, ears pinned back against his head. When Marcus stepped out of the vehicle, the horse released a piercing whinny that sounded more like a warning than a greeting. "Stay back," Marcus cautioned as James approached the fence slowly. "He'll charge if you get too close." But James wasn't moving with the energy of someone trying to dominate or control. He walked with the same careful deliberation he had learned in the war, reading the situation, assessing the threat level, looking for the story beneath the surface. He stopped about 10 feet from the fence and simply stood there, not staring directly at Thunder but watching him peripherally, letting the horse get used to his presence. Thunder noticed him immediately, as James knew he would. The horse's pacing slowed slightly, his attention fixed on this new human who wasn't behaving like the others. James kept his posture relaxed, his breathing steady, his hands visible and empty. He didn't speak, didn't make sudden movements, just existed in the space and let Thunder process this new element in his carefully controlled world of isolation and anger. Minutes passed in silence. Marcus stood by the vehicle, watching with barely concealed impatience. Thunder continued to pace, but with less agitation now, occasionally glancing toward James as if trying to understand what this human wanted. James recognized the behavior, the constant vigilance of a creature that had learned the hard way that letting your guard down meant getting hurt. "You've been through hell, haven't you, boy?" James said finally, his voice low and calm, barely above a murmur. "Someone hurt you bad, made you think that's all humans are good for. I know how that feels. I know what it's like when the world becomes a threat and fighting is the only way you know to survive. Thunder's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice, a tiny movement but significant. The horse had stopped pacing completely now, standing still as he watched this stranger who spoke without aggression, without the edge of fear or anger that usually laced human voices around him. James took one slow step closer to the fence, then another, moving with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. Behind him, Marcus tensed, ready to pull James back if the horse charged. But Thunder didn't charge. Instead, the massive stallion took a few steps toward the fence, curiosity apparently overriding caution. He stopped about 15 feet away, nostrils flaring as he tried to catch James's scent, his powerful body coiled with the potential for explosive violence but holding still for now. James felt something unlock in his chest, a connection forming that he couldn't quite explain. It was the same intuition he had relied on with horses as a kid, that sense of understanding that went beyond words or logic. Thunder wasn't a monster or a lost cause. He was a survivor dealing with trauma, the only way he knew how, lashing out before anyone could hurt him first. James understood that strategy intimately. "He's afraid," James said quietly to Marcus without turning around. "All that aggression, it's fear. Someone abused this horse, probably when he was younger. They broke something in him, taught him that trust equals pain. That's why your trainers couldn't reach him. They were trying to dominate him, establish control, but what he needs is to feel safe first." Marcus walked closer, studying Thunder with new eyes. "You really think you can help him?" The doubt in his voice had shifted slightly, now mixed with something that might have been hope. James finally turned to look at the ranch owner. "I think we can help each other," he said honestly. Marcus stood there for a long moment, weighing his options. James could see the calculation happening behind the man's eyes, the businessman assessing risks and potential returns. Finally, Marcus sighed, a sound that carried the weight of desperation and diminishing choices. "All right," he said, "I'll give you 2 weeks. That's all I can afford to wait before I have to make a final decision about Thunder, but I have conditions." James nodded, expecting as much. "First, you work with him every day, no exceptions. Second, you don't go inside that paddock alone, not until I'm convinced it's safe. Third, any sign that this isn't working, any indication he's getting worse instead of better, and we're done." Marcus paused, then added more gently, "And fourth, you need a place to stay while you're doing this. There's a small room above the main stable, nothing fancy, but it has a bed and a bathroom. You can stay there." The offer caught James off guard, and he felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. He had been prepared to walk back to town each night, to continue sleeping rough while working with Thunder during the days. The idea of having a roof over his head, even temporarily, felt like an almost unbearable luxury. "I appreciate that," he managed to say. "More than you know." Marcus waved off the gratitude, clearly uncomfortable with sentiment. "Just be ready to start tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. Carl, my ranch manager, will show you the room and get you whatever supplies you need. And Sullivan," he added, his voice taking on a serious edge, "be careful. I don't want to have to tell my aunt that I let you get yourself killed." That evening, James settled into the small room above the stable, a space that was probably meant for seasonal workers or visiting trainers. It was simple but clean, with a single bed, a small table and chair, a bathroom with a shower that actually had hot water. James stood under that shower for almost 30 minutes, letting the heat sink into muscles that had been tense for months, washing away layers of street grime and feeling almost human again. He lay on the bed that night, the mattress soft beneath him, a real pillow under his head, and stared at the ceiling. The nightmares would probably still come. They always did. But at least for now he was safe, warm and dry. And he had a purpose again, something to wake up for that wasn't just survival. His thoughts drifted to Thunder, to the recognition he had seen in those dark eyes, the mirror of his own pain and defensive fury. The next morning arrived too quickly, and yet not quickly enough. James was awake before dawn, unable to sleep from a mixture of anticipation and residual anxiety. He dressed in the clean clothes that Carl had left for him the night before, sturdy work pants and a flannel shirt that smelled like detergent instead of the street. When he walked down to the paddock as the sun was rising, Thunder was already waiting, standing alert at the far end of his prison. James had brought a simple camp stool with him, and he set it up about 20 feet from the fence. He sat down without ceremony and simply waited. This was the first lesson he remembered from his uncle, that patience was the foundation of everything with horses. You couldn't force trust, couldn't demand connection. You had to let it develop naturally at the animal's pace, not yours. Thunder watched him suspiciously for the first hour, pacing occasionally but never taking his eyes off this strange human who just sat there doing nothing. James didn't pull out his phone because he didn't have one. He didn't read a book or try to entertain himself. He just sat, breathing steadily, occasionally looking at Thunder but never staring, letting his presence become part of the landscape rather than a threat. By the second hour, Thunder's pacing had slowed. The horse would stop every few minutes, looking at James as if trying to understand what game this was, what the catch would be. James remained still, a statue of patience. He thought about his time in Afghanistan, the long hours of waiting during operations, the discipline required to stay focused and alert while nothing was happening. This was different but similar, a test of will and commitment. Around mid-morning, Carl came by to check on him. The ranch manager looked at James sitting on his stool, then at Thunder, who was now standing relatively calm at the opposite fence, and shook his head. "You planning to just sit there all day?" he asked, not unkindly. James smiled slightly. "As long as it takes," he replied. "I'm letting him get used to me, showing him I'm not a threat." Carl grunted, clearly skeptical, but not interfering. "There's water and sandwiches in the cooler by the gate if you need them." The day wore on. The sun climbed higher, bringing warmth that made James drowsy, but he fought off the urge to nap. Thunder had moved closer without seeming to realize it, now standing only about 30 feet away instead of at the far fence. The horse's ears were forward more often than back now, his posture less rigidly defensive. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. James began to talk, keeping his voice low and conversational. He told Thunder about growing up in Kentucky, about his uncle's farm and the horses he had known as a kid. He talked about a mare named Daisy, who had been abused before his uncle bought her, how she had been terrified of everyone at first, but eventually became the gentlest horse on the farm. He talked about the trust she had learned to give, the healing that had happened when someone finally showed her that not all humans were cruel. Thunder's ears swiveled toward the sound of his voice, the horse clearly listening even if he couldn't understand the words. It wasn't about the content anyway. It was about tone, about the rhythm of speech that held no anger or aggression, about creating an auditory presence that was soothing rather than threatening. James had learned in the war that sometimes talking to yourself or your buddies was what kept you sane during the endless hours of boredom between moments of terror. Now he was using that same technique with a horse who needed to hear that human voices didn't always precede pain. By afternoon, something remarkable happened. Thunder took 3 deliberate steps toward James, then stopped, as if testing whether this would trigger the usual human response of trying to grab him, rope him, control him. James didn't move. He kept talking in that same low voice, now telling Thunder about Afghanistan, about the things he had seen and done, the brothers he had lost, the weight of survival when others hadn't made it. Maybe it was crazy to confess his trauma to a horse, but James found the words flowing easier than they ever had with therapists or counselors. Thunder couldn't judge him, couldn't offer platitudes or look at him with pity. The horse just listened, and in that listening, James felt something loosening in his chest, some of the tightness that had lived there since he came home from war. Thunder took another step forward, then another, and now he was close enough that James could see the scars on his coat, faint lines that spoke of whips or rough handling. The horse's eyes were still wary but no longer wild. There was an intelligence there, a soul that had been battered but not broken, just like James himself. They studied each other across the remaining distance, two survivors recognizing something fundamental in each other. "I know you're scared," James said softly. "I know you think if you let anyone close, they'll hurt you. I've been there, Thunder. I'm still there most days. But maybe we can figure this out together. Maybe two broken things can help each other heal." The horse's nostrils flared as he caught James's scent on the breeze, processing this human who smelled different from the others, who carried his own pain visible in every movement. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thunder stood just 10 feet from where James sat. It had taken an entire day to close that distance, hours of patience and stillness and gentle words. But as James stood up slowly, careful not to startle the horse, he felt a satisfaction deeper than any he had known in months. "Good boy," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we'll try again, and maybe you'll come a little closer. There's no rush, Thunder. We've got time, and I'm not going anywhere." He picked up his stool and walked back toward the gate, aware of Thunder's eyes following his every movement. As he reached the fence, he heard something that made him turn. Thunder had walked up to the fence line, as close as the horse had been to any human in months, and was watching James with what might have been curiosity or confusion, or the first fragile threads of trust beginning to form. The days began to establish a rhythm that James found comforting in its predictability. He would wake before dawn, the nightmares still visiting him most nights, but somehow less intense now that he had something concrete to focus on during his waking hours. He would make himself coffee in the small kitchenette in his room, then head down to Thunder's paddock with his stool, a thermos, and whatever book Carl had lent him from the ranch library, though he rarely read more than a few pages. By the third day, Thunder was waiting for him at the fence when he arrived, the horse's ears pricked forward with what James chose to interpret as anticipation rather than mere alertness. James set up his stool in the same spot as always, understanding that consistency was crucial for an animal that had experienced too much chaos and unpredictability. Thunder watched him settle in, then moved to his own preferred spot about 8 feet away, close enough now that James could hear the horse's breathing, could see the subtle shifts in his expression. That morning, James brought something new. He had asked Carl for some apples from the ranch kitchen, and he placed one on the ground about 5 feet in front of him, then returned to his stool without trying to coax Thunder closer. The horse noticed the apple immediately, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent. For 20 minutes, Thunder simply stared at it, the internal debate visible in his tense posture. Food meant approaching. Approaching meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant potential pain. James kept talking, his voice a steady stream of meaningless conversation that was really about tone and presence. He talked about the weather, about the other horses he could see in the distant pastures, about the barn cat he had seen hunting mice that morning. He didn't look directly at Thunder or the apple, giving the horse space to make his own decision without the pressure of human expectation. Finally, Thunder took a step forward, then another. His movements were slow, calculated, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. James kept his body language relaxed, slouched comfortably on his stool, apparently absorbed in examining his fingernails. The horse reached the apple and grabbed it quickly, retreating several steps before he began to eat, his eyes never leaving James. It was a small victory, but James felt his heart swell with it. Trust was being built in inches, in these tiny moments of risk rewarded rather than punished. Over the following days, James gradually moved the apple closer to where he sat. Thunder's approach became more confident, less skittish, though he still maintained his escape route and his vigilance. By day 7, James was holding the apple in his outstretched hand, and after what felt like an eternity of deliberation, Thunder stepped close enough to take it directly from his palm. The sensation of those soft lips against his skin, the warmth of the horse's breath, the brief moment of contact, brought tears to James's eyes that he quickly blinked away. "Good boy, Thunder," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "See? Not all humans are bad. Some of us are just trying to figure things out too." The horse chewed the apple thoughtfully, standing now close enough that James could have reached out and touched him. But he didn't. He knew that Thunder needed to be the one to close that final distance, to make the choice to accept touch rather than have it imposed upon him. Marcus had been stopping by daily, watching from a distance, with an expression that grew less skeptical and more amazed as the week progressed. On the 8th day, he approached James during a break, shaking his head in disbelief. "I've seen a lot of horse trainers work," he said, "but I've never seen anything like this. You haven't even been in the paddock with him yet, and he's already more calm than I've seen him in 2 years. How are you doing this?" James considered the question carefully. "I'm not doing anything to him," he explained. "That's the difference. Every other trainer was trying to break him, bend him to their will, establish dominance, but Thunder's already been broken once, probably brutally. He doesn't need someone to break him again. He needs someone to just exist alongside him without demands, without force, without punishment. He needs to relearn that humans can be safe." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. "My aunt told me you served in Afghanistan. She said you came back different, struggled with things." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Is that why you understand him? Because you know what it's like to be broken?" The blunt question would have offended James coming from most people, but there was no judgment in Marcus's voice, only genuine curiosity and something that might have been respect. "Yeah," James admitted quietly. "I know what it's like when the world becomes a threat, when your brain gets rewired to see danger everywhere. I know what it's like when people expect you to just snap back to normal, to be who you were before, when that person doesn't exist anymore. Thunder gets that. We speak the same language." The breakthrough came on day 10. James had been sitting as usual, Thunder standing nearby eating hay, when a sudden loud bang echoed across the ranch. Someone had dropped something metal in one of the distant barns, the sound sharp and explosive. Thunder's reaction was instantaneous, rearing up with a panicked whinny, his eyes rolling white with terror. But instead of charging the fence or running to the far corner as he would have done before, the horse turned to James. In that moment of pure instinct, Thunder sought safety in the one presence that had become familiar and non-threatening. The horse moved toward James rather than away from him, and James, operating on his own instincts, stood up and held out his hand. "Easy, Thunder," he said firmly but calmly. "You're okay. It was just noise. You're safe." Thunder stopped just inches from him, his massive body trembling, breath coming in rapid snorts. James didn't think about the risk, didn't calculate the danger of standing within striking distance of a horse that had put men in the hospital. He simply placed his hand on Thunder's neck, feeling the powerful muscles quivering beneath the sleek coat. The horse flinched at first contact but didn't pull away. James began to stroke gently, rhythmically, his touch light and reassuring. "It's okay, boy. I've got you. Nothing's going to hurt you while I'm here." They stood like that for several minutes, James murmuring reassurances while Thunder's panic slowly subsided. The horse's breathing gradually slowed, his trembling decreased, and something fundamental shifted between them. Thunder had sought comfort from a human. had accepted touch in a moment of fear, and had found that it helped rather than hurt. It was a turning point, and both of them seemed to recognize its significance. When Thunder finally stepped back, James saw something different in the horse's eyes. The wariness was still there, would probably always be there to some degree, but it was tempered now with something else. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of actual trust. James's hand was still extended, and after a moment's hesitation, Thunder stepped forward again and pressed his nose into James's palm, a gesture of acceptance that made James's chest tight with emotion he couldn't name. Carl witnessed the entire exchange from the utility vehicle he had parked nearby. When James finally left the paddock area that evening, the ranch manager was waiting for him, his weathered face showing an expression James couldn't quite read. "That was something," Carl said simply. "In 40 years of working with horses, I've never seen anything quite like what you just did. That horse chose to trust you. You gave him back something I didn't think he'd ever have again." James didn't know how to respond to the praise, so he just nodded. "Thunder did the hard part," he said. "I just showed up and didn't hurt him. Sometimes that's enough." Carl clapped him on the shoulder, a brief gesture of solidarity that meant more to James than elaborate compliments would have. "Marcus is going to want to see you tomorrow," the ranch manager said. "I think you've earned more than 2 weeks here." That night, James lay in his bed above the stable, listening to the soft sounds of horses settling in for the night. For the first time since before the war, since before everything fell apart, he felt like he might have found a place where he belonged. It wasn't just about having a roof over his head or regular meals, though those things mattered. It was about having a purpose, about using skills he thought he'd lost, about connecting with another living being who understood what it meant to survive trauma. Thunder had given him something precious in that moment of panic when the horse had turned to him for safety. The animal had shown James that he was capable of being trusted, of being a source of comfort rather than a burden. For someone who had felt useless and broken for so long, that validation was transformative. James didn't know what the future held, didn't know if Marcus would let him stay beyond the original agreement, didn't know if he could actually help Thunder heal completely. But for tonight, it was enough to know that progress was being made, that 2 damaged souls had found each other and were slowly, carefully, learning to trust again. The meeting with Marcus happened the next morning over coffee in the ranch office. James sat across from the man who had given him this chance, acutely aware of how much his life had changed in just 10 days. Marcus poured them both coffee from an expensive machine, then settled back in his leather chair, studying James with an expression that was hard to read. "Carl told me what happened yesterday," Marcus began. "He said Thunder actually came to you for comfort, let you touch him without any resistance. In 2 years, I couldn't get within 10 feet of that horse without him trying to take my head off." James sipped his coffee, unsure where this conversation was heading. "Thunder needed someone who understood fear," he said simply. "Someone who wouldn't punish him for being scared." Marcus nodded slowly, then leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. "I'm going to be straight with you, Sullivan. When my aunt first suggested you, I thought it was charity. A way for her to help someone down on their luck by giving you something to do for a couple weeks. I didn't actually think you'd make any real progress with Thunder." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "I was wrong. What you've accomplished in 10 days is nothing short of remarkable." James felt heat rising in his face, unaccustomed to praise. "I haven't accomplished anything yet," he protested. "Thunder's still traumatized, still has a long way to go before he could be considered trained or even fully safe. All I've done is show him that one human won't hurt him. That's not the same as healing." "Maybe not," Marcus agreed, "but it's further than anyone else has gotten, and it's made me rethink some things about this ranch, about how we approach difficult animals, about what success really means." He stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the property. "I'd like to offer you a job, Sullivan. Not temporary, not charity. A real position as an animal rehabilitation specialist. You'd work with Thunder until he's ready for whatever comes next, and then you'd help with other difficult cases as they come up. The offer hung in the air between them, and James felt his heart pounding. A job meant stability, meant a future beyond day-to-day survival, meant being able to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. But it also meant responsibility, meant people depending on him, meant risking failure in a way that mattered. "What if I can't do it?" he asked quietly. "What if Thunder's progress stops here? Or what if I make things worse?" Marcus turned from the window, his expression serious but not unkind. "Then you'll have tried, and that's more than most people do. Look, Sullivan, I'm not expecting miracles. I'm offering you this because you've shown me something I'd forgotten, that sometimes the conventional approach isn't the right one, that sometimes what looks like weakness is actually strength. You understand trauma in a way my expensive trainers never could. That's worth something." James thought about the men he'd served with, the ones who hadn't made it home, the promises he'd made to himself about not wasting the second chance he'd been given. "If I accept, I need to do it my way," he said, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. "That means no rushing Thunder, no forcing him into situations he's not ready for, no declaring him cured just because he stops being aggressive. Real healing takes time." "Agreed," Marcus said without hesitation. "You'll have full authority over his care and training. I'll provide whatever resources you need. All I ask is that you document what you're doing so we can potentially use your methods with other horses in the future." James extended his hand and Marcus shook it, sealing an agreement that felt like more than just employment. It felt like redemption, like proof that broken things could still be useful, could still contribute something meaningful to the world. The next phase of work with Thunder began that afternoon. James entered the paddock for the first time, moving slowly and deliberately, announcing his presence with soft words. Thunder watched from across the enclosure, his body tense but not panicked. The horse had learned over the past 10 days that James's presence didn't automatically mean danger, but being in his space was different from being on opposite sides of a fence. James carried nothing with him except an apple in his pocket and a lead rope draped loosely over his shoulder, not intending to use it, but wanting Thunder to get accustomed to seeing it without associating it with force or restraint. He walked to the center of the paddock and simply stood there, giving Thunder time to process this change in their dynamic. The horse took several minutes before moving, then slowly approached, his steps cautious but curious. When Thunder reached him, James offered the apple on his flat palm. The horse took it gently, and while he was eating, James raised his other hand and rested it on Thunder's neck. The muscles beneath his palm were tense, ready to explode into flight, but Thunder didn't move away. James began to stroke in long, slow movements, talking quietly about nothing in particular, just letting his voice and touch become associated with peace rather than pain. They stood like that for nearly an hour, James gradually moving his hands over Thunder's neck, shoulders, and back, finding the old scars, the places where whips had landed or rough hands had grabbed too hard. Each scar told a story of cruelty and fear, and James acknowledged them silently, his touch gentle over the damaged areas. Thunder's breathing eventually deepened, his head lowering slightly, and James recognized the signs of a horse beginning to relax, to let go of the constant vigilance that had been his survival mechanism. Over the following days, their sessions grew longer and more varied. James introduced grooming tools, starting with just a soft brush that he let Thunder sniff and investigate before using it. The first stroke of the brush across Thunder's coat made the horse flinch, but James persisted with patient gentleness, and soon Thunder was leaning into the sensation, clearly enjoying the attention. It was intimate work, this process of teaching Thunder that touch could feel good, that being cared for didn't have to come with strings attached or hidden violence. The ranch hands had started to notice the transformation. Workers who had given Thunder's paddock a wide berth now paused to watch James working with the once feared stallion. Some were skeptical, waiting for the inevitable explosion of violence they assumed would come. Others were quietly amazed, spreading word through the community about the homeless vet who was working miracles with the killer horse. James tried to ignore both the skepticism and the praise, focusing entirely on Thunder and the small victories that happened every day. But progress was never linear. On day 16, something triggered Thunder during their session. Perhaps it was the way a shadow fell across the paddock, or a sound that reminded him of past trauma, or simply the accumulated stress of being vulnerable after so many months of defensive isolation. Whatever the cause, Thunder suddenly reared up, his front hooves pawing the air dangerously close to James's head. The horse's eyes showed white all around, panic overtaking the trust they had been building. James's military training kicked in instantly. Instead of running or showing fear, which would have confirmed Thunder's terror and potentially triggered a worse reaction, James dropped to one knee and made himself smaller, less threatening. He kept talking, his voice steady and calm despite his racing heart. "It's okay, Thunder. You're safe. Whatever scared you, it's gone. I'm not going to hurt you. You know that. You know me." The words might not have made sense to the horse, but the tone did. Thunder came down hard on all four hooves, breathing heavily, trembling with the adrenaline of his fear response. He could have run, could have attacked, could have reverted completely to his old defensive patterns. Instead, after several tense moments, Thunder took a step toward James, then another, seeking the reassurance he had learned to find in this human's presence. James stood slowly, extending his hand. Thunder pressed his nose into it, and James felt the horse's rapid breath against his palm. "That's it, boy. You're okay. We're okay." He placed his other hand on Thunder's neck, feeling the galloping heartbeat gradually slow. They stood together while Thunder calmed, and James realized his own hands were shaking. The moment had been dangerous, could have ended badly, but it had also proven something crucial. When frightened, Thunder now turned toward connection rather than away from it. That was real progress, the kind that couldn't be faked or rushed. That evening, James sat on the porch of his room above the stable, watching the sun set over the ranch. His body ached from the tension of the day, and his mind was processing the fear he had felt when Thunder reared up. But underneath the exhaustion and lingering adrenaline, there was satisfaction. He had faced danger and hadn't frozen or panicked. He had trusted his instincts, and they had been right. Thunder was healing, and somehow, in the process of helping the horse, James was healing too. Word about Thunder's transformation spread beyond the ranch faster than James had anticipated. By the third week, people from neighboring farms and even some from town started showing up at Bellamy Ranch, curious to see the killer horse that was supposedly being tamed by a homeless veteran. Marcus initially tried to turn them away, protective of both James's privacy and Thunder's progress. But eventually he realized that the attention could be beneficial if managed properly. On a crisp Saturday morning, Marcus approached James as he was preparing for his daily session with Thunder. "We've got some visitors," he said, gesturing toward a small group gathered near the ranch office. "Local news wants to do a story about you and Thunder. I told them I'd ask you first, that it's your choice whether you want that kind of attention." James felt his stomach clench with anxiety. The idea of cameras and reporters, of his face and story being broadcast, brought back the hypervigilance he had worked so hard to manage. But he also understood that this wasn't just about him anymore. If people could see what was possible with patience and understanding, maybe other traumatized animals would get second chances instead of being destroyed. Maybe other veterans would see that healing was possible, that being broken didn't mean being worthless. "I'll do it," James said, surprised by his own decision. but only if we can make it clear that this isn't about me being some kind of horse whisperer or miracle worker. This is about giving Thunder time and space to heal on his own terms." Marcus smiled, relief evident in his expression. "I'll make sure they understand that." The interview took place outside Thunder's paddock, with James standing at the fence and Thunder grazing peacefully nearby, occasionally lifting his head to check on James's location. The reporter, a young woman named Sarah Chen, asked thoughtful questions that showed she had actually done research rather than just looking for a feel-good story. She asked about James's background with horses, about his military service, and about what made his approach different from traditional training methods. James found himself opening up more than he intended. He talked about how trauma changes the brain, how fear becomes hardwired into responses that look like aggression but are really just desperate attempts at self-protection. He talked about his own struggles after coming home from war, about the nightmares and anxiety that had cost him everything he thought he had. And he talked about Thunder, about recognizing in this horse's eyes the same haunted look he saw in the mirror. "Thunder isn't aggressive because he's mean or crazy," James explained, his voice steady even as he shared difficult truths. "He's aggressive because someone taught him that humans equal pain. Every person who tried to force him into submission just confirmed that lesson. My job isn't to dominate him or break his spirit. It's to show him that there's another way, that trust is possible even after betrayal." As if on cue, Thunder walked over to the fence and nuzzled James's shoulder, a gesture of affection that would have been unthinkable a month ago. Sarah's cameraman caught the moment, and even the hardened news crew seemed moved by the obvious bond between man and horse. "That's beautiful," Sarah said softly, then asked, "What do you want people to understand about what you're doing here?" James considered the question carefully, aware that his answer might reach people who were struggling with their own demons, human or animal. "I want them to know that healing isn't linear," he said. "There are setbacks and bad days. Progress is measured in small moments, not dramatic transformations. And most importantly, I want people to understand that just because something is broken doesn't mean it's beyond repair. Thunder deserves a second chance, and so do I, and so does everyone who's fighting battles that others can't see." The story aired the following Tuesday evening, and the response was overwhelming. The ranch phone rang constantly with calls from people wanting to know more, from other horse owners with difficult animals, from veterans organizations wanting to explore animal therapy programs, from donors offering to fund James's work. Marcus hired an assistant just to handle the inquiries, and suddenly James found himself not just healing one horse, but potentially influencing how traumatized animals were treated across the region. But the attention also brought complications. A man showed up at the ranch 3 days after the story aired, claiming to be Thunder's original owner before the horse had been sold to the racing stable that eventually sold him to Marcus. His name was Richard Lawson, and he arrived in an expensive truck with a trailer demanding to see Thunder. Marcus met him at the gate, his body language protective. "What's your business here, Mr. Lawson?" The man, tall and broad-shouldered with cold eyes, pulled out some papers. "That horse was stolen from my property 2 years ago. I've been looking for him ever since. Now that I've seen the news story, I know where he is, and I want him back." James had come down from the paddock when he heard the raised voices. As he approached, he studied Lawson carefully, noting the man's aggressive posture, the way his jaw clenched when he looked toward Thunder's paddock, the faint scent of alcohol on his breath even though it was barely noon. Everything about Lawson set off alarm bells, and James felt his protective instincts surge. "Thunder wasn't stolen," Marcus said firmly, examining the papers. "I have a clear bill of sale from Riverside Racing Stables. They purchased him legally at auction after his previous owner defaulted on debts. If you're claiming ownership, you'll need to take it up with them and provide proof." Lawson's face reddened with anger. "That auction was illegal. I never authorized the sale. That's my horse, worth a fortune with his bloodline, and some drunk stable owner had no right to sell him. I want Thunder back, and I want him now, or I'll get the sheriff involved." James stepped forward, placing himself between Lawson and the path to Thunder's paddock. The movement was instinctive, protective, and it didn't go unnoticed. Lawson's eyes narrowed as he looked James up and down, taking in the worn clothes and military bearing. "And who are you supposed to be, the homeless guy from the news? You think you can keep me from my property?" The words were designed to wound, to diminish, to put James in his place. A month ago, they might have worked, might have sent James spiraling into shame and self-doubt. But standing there with Thunder's paddock behind him, with a purpose that felt solid and real, James found that Lawson's contempt couldn't touch him. "I'm the person who's been healing the damage you caused," James said quietly, his voice hard as steel. "And I'm telling you right now that Thunder isn't going anywhere with you." The tension crackled in the air. Lawson took a step forward, his hands balling into fists, but Marcus intervened. "Mr. Lawson, you need to leave my property now. If you have a legal claim to Thunder, you can pursue it through the courts, but you're not taking that horse today, and if you don't leave immediately, I'll call the sheriff myself for trespassing." For a long moment, it seemed like Lawson might push the confrontation further, but something in Marcus's steady gaze, or perhaps in James's protective stance, made him reconsider. He pointed at James with barely controlled rage. "This isn't over. That horse is mine, and I'll prove it. When I get him back, we'll see how long his good behavior lasts under proper discipline." The threat hung in the air even after Lawson's truck disappeared down the ranch road. James felt his hands shaking with adrenaline and something darker, a rage at the thought of Thunder being returned to someone who had clearly abused him. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll fight this," he said. "I've got lawyers who can review the sale documents, establish clear ownership. Thunder's not going back to someone who hurt him." But as James walked back to Thunder's paddock, he couldn't shake the fear that had lodged itself in his chest. The law didn't always protect those who needed it most. He had seen that in his own life, in the bureaucratic nightmares of the VA system, in the way society treated its most vulnerable. What if legal documents and paperwork mattered more than Thunder's well-being? What if all the progress they had made could be undone by a judge's ruling? Thunder sensed his distress immediately when James entered the paddock. The horse approached, pressing his head against James's chest in a gesture that had become their form of greeting and comfort. James wrapped his arms around Thunder's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of horse and hay, feeling the solid warmth of this creature who had come to mean so much to him. "I won't let him take you," James whispered into Thunder's mane. "I don't care what I have to do. You're safe here, and you're going to stay safe." The promise felt huge and terrifying, but also absolutely necessary. Thunder had trusted him, had chosen to believe that this human was different from the others who had hurt him. James couldn't let that trust be betrayed, couldn't stand by while Thunder was sent back to abuse and trauma. As the sun set that evening, James sat with Thunder in the paddock, both of them quiet, both processing the threat that had entered their world. The peace they had built together felt fragile now, vulnerable to forces beyond their control. But in that fragility, James found a fierce determination. He had survived war, survived homelessness, survived the darkest moments of his own mind. He would survive this too, and he would make sure Thunder did as well. Some battles were worth fighting, and this was one of them. The legal battle began in earnest the following week. Marcus's attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Morales, who specialized in equine law, reviewed all the documentation surrounding Thunder's ownership. She sat across from James and Marcus in the ranch office, spreading papers across the desk with methodical precision. The news wasn't entirely good. Lawson does have some documentation showing he purchased a horse matching Thunder's description 5 years ago. Patricia explained, her finger tracing lines on a bill of sale. However, the auction that transferred Thunder to Riverside Racing Stables was legitimate. Lawson had outstanding debts, his assets were seized, and the horses were sold legally to satisfy creditors. His claim that the sale was unauthorized doesn't hold water based on what I'm seeing. Marcus leaned forward. So we're safe? Thunder stays here? Patricia hesitated, and that pause made James's stomach drop. It's not that simple, she continued. Lawson is arguing that Thunder was specifically excluded from the asset seizure due to his value and breeding potential. He's claiming the auction house made an error in including him. If he can prove that exclusion was documented before the sale, he might have a case. The words hung heavy in the air. James felt his jaw clench, frustration building at the absurdity of legal technicalities determining Thunder's fate. This isn't about ownership documents, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. That man hurt Thunder. You can see it in the scars on his body, in the way he reacts to certain things. Sending him back would be like sending someone back to their abuser. Patricia's expression softened with sympathy. I understand, Mr. Sullivan, but unfortunately, the law treats horses as property, not as beings with rights to protection from abuse. Our best argument is that the sale was legal and binding, regardless of Lawson's current claims. We fight this on procedural grounds, not emotional ones. Over the next 2 weeks, the case consumed everyone's attention. Marcus spent hours with Patricia, gathering documentation, tracking down witnesses from the original auction, building their defense. James threw himself into working with Thunder, as if every moment of progress could somehow strengthen their case, prove that the horse deserved to stay where he was healing rather than returning to where he had been broken. But the stress was taking its toll on both of them. Thunder became more skittish, picking up on James's anxiety in the way animals do, sensing that something was wrong even if he couldn't understand what. James's nightmares returned with a vengeance, his sleep disrupted by dreams where he watched helplessly as Thunder was loaded into Lawson's trailer, the horse's terrified eyes finding his as he was taken away. The community response, however, was overwhelming in its support. The news story had resonated with people across the county, and when word spread about Lawson's claim, donations started pouring in to help with legal fees. The local veterans organization held a fundraiser, raising thousands of dollars for Thunder's defense. Children sent letters and drawings, pictures of horses with hearts around them, pleading for Thunder to be allowed to stay at the ranch. Mrs. Chen, Marcus's aunt, and the librarian who had first connected James with this opportunity, organized a petition that gathered over 5,000 signatures in a week. She delivered it to Patricia's office personally, her elderly frame somehow imposing in its determination. This horse matters to people, she told the attorney. And so does James. They've both been given a second chance here, and we're not going to stand by quietly while someone tries to take that away. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning at the county courthouse. James dressed in the one decent outfit Marcus had bought him for the occasion, a button-down shirt and slacks that felt strange after months of work clothes. His hands shook as he tried to tie the unfamiliar necktie, and he finally gave up, leaving it hanging loose around his neck. Thunder had been his focus, his purpose, his path back to something resembling a normal life. The thought of losing him felt like losing everything all over again. Marcus drove them to the courthouse with Patricia following in her own car. The parking lot was more crowded than expected, and as they walked toward the entrance, James realized why. Dozens of people had gathered, holding signs that read, "Save Thunder" and "Second Chances." Matter and veterans and horses heal together. He recognized faces from the ranch, from town, strangers who had been moved by the news story and wanted to show their support. Tommy, the older homeless man James had known from the breakfast line, stood near the front steps. He caught James's eye and gave a solemn nod of solidarity. Maria, the single mother, held her young daughter's hand, the child clutching a drawing of a horse. Even some of the ranch hands had taken the morning off to attend, standing in a quiet cluster that spoke more powerfully than any words could about their belief in what James was doing. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere shifted to formal proceedings and legal language. Judge Catherine Rivera presided, a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back severely and an expression that revealed nothing. Lawson sat at the plaintiff's table with his own attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit. When Lawson's eyes met James's, there was no warmth, only cold calculation and a sense of ownership that made James's skin crawl. The hearing proceeded with the mechanical precision of legal proceedings. Lawson's attorney argued that Thunder had been improperly included in the asset seizure, presenting documents that he claimed proved the horse was meant to be excluded due to his breeding value. Patricia countered with the auction records, bills of sale, and testimony from the auction house confirming that all proper procedures had been followed. Then Lawson himself took the stand, and James had to grip the edge of his seat to keep from reacting. The man spoke about Thunder in terms of dollar amounts and breeding potential, referring to the horse as an investment that had been stolen from him. When asked about Thunder's current condition and the transformation James had achieved, Lawson dismissed it with a wave of his hand. That horse was always manageable when handled properly, Lawson said, his tone condescending. The so-called aggressive behavior was likely the result of improper training by the racing stable. I know how to handle spirited animals. They need a firm hand, clear discipline. All this talk about trauma and healing is just anthropomorphic nonsense. He's a horse, not a person. James felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. The casual dismissal of Thunder's suffering, the implication that the abuse had been justified discipline, the way Lawson spoke about living beings as if they were objects without feelings or capacity for pain, it all combined into a fury that James struggled to contain. Marcus placed a warning hand on his arm, understanding without words that James was close to doing something that would hurt their case. When it was Patricia's turn to present their side, she called James to the stand. He walked up on shaking legs, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Patricia's questions were gentle, designed to let him tell Thunder's story in his own words. James talked about finding a horse so traumatized that no one could approach him safely, about the patient work of building trust, about recognizing in Thunder the same defensive patterns that James himself had developed after trauma. Thunder wasn't aggressive because he's spirited or difficult, James said, his voice steady despite his nerves. He was aggressive because he was terrified. Someone had hurt him so badly that violence became his only defense mechanism. I know because I understand that response. After Afghanistan, I saw threats everywhere, pushed people away before they could hurt me. Thunder was doing the same thing, and he needed someone who wouldn't punish him for being scared. He described the progress they had made, the small victories, the moment when Thunder had turned to him for comfort instead of lashing out in fear. He talked about the scars on Thunder's body, the evidence of abuse that anyone could see if they bothered to look. And he looked directly at Lawson when he said, "That horse deserves to be somewhere safe with people who see him as more than property or profit. He deserves the chance to heal." Lawson's attorney tried to discredit James on cross-examination, bringing up his homelessness, his lack of professional training credentials, suggesting that his emotional attachment to Thunder clouded his judgment. But James refused to be shaken. His voice remained calm as he acknowledged his struggles, his past, his unconventional path to working with horses. "Yes, I was homeless. Yes, I have PTSD. And yes, that's exactly why I understand what Thunder needs, because I've been where he is." The judge listened to everything with that same unreadable expression, asking occasional questions that revealed a sharp legal mind working through the complexities. When both sides had presented their arguments, she called for a brief recess before issuing her preliminary ruling. James, Marcus, and Patricia stepped outside into the hallway where their supporters had gathered, waiting anxiously for news. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. James paced, unable to sit still, his mind running through everything that had been said, everything he wished he had expressed better. What if the judge decided the law was clear and ownership trumped everything else? What if Thunder was ordered returned to Lawson? What if all the progress, all the healing, all the trust they had built was destroyed by a legal technicality? Mrs. Chen approached him with a cup of water he didn't remember asking for. "Whatever happens in there," she said softly, "you've already changed things, James. People see horses differently now because of your story. They see veterans differently too. That matters, regardless of what the judge decides." James appreciated her words but couldn't find comfort in them. It wasn't enough to have made an impact if Thunder paid the price. The horse had trusted him, had chosen to be vulnerable, had started to believe that safety was possible. James couldn't bear the thought of betraying that trust, even if the betrayal came from circumstances beyond his control. The bailiff emerged from the courtroom and called them back inside. James's heart pounded as they took their seats as Judge Rivera returned to the bench as the moment of decision arrived. Judge Rivera settled into her seat and looked out over the courtroom with an expression that had shifted from neutral to something more contemplative. She took a moment to arrange her notes before speaking, and in that silence, James felt every second stretch into eternity. The judge's eyes moved from Lawson to Marcus, then finally to James, and something in her gaze made him sit up straighter. This case presents an interesting intersection of property law, animal welfare, and questions of what we owe to creatures in our care, Judge Rivera began, her voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. "Mr. Lawson, you have presented documentation suggesting that Thunder should have been excluded from your asset seizure. However, after reviewing the timeline and the creditor proceedings, I find that the auction house followed proper protocol. The exclusion you reference was filed after the seizure order was executed, making it invalid." James felt a flicker of hope, but the judge wasn't finished. From a purely legal standpoint, Mr. Bellamy's ownership of Thunder through the auction purchase is legitimate and binding. The horse is his property, acquired through legal means, and Mr. Lawson's claim of improper sale does not have sufficient merit to override that ownership. Relief flooded through James, but he caught the way Judge Rivera's expression had shifted, becoming more serious, almost stern. "However," she continued, and the word hung in the air like a threat, "this case has brought to my attention concerns that go beyond simple property ownership. Mr. Lawson, the testimony we heard today included descriptions of scarring and behavioral evidence consistent with past abuse. While horses are legally considered property, animal cruelty is still a crime in this state." Lawson's face reddened, and his attorney leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear. Judge Rivera raised a hand for silence. "I am ordering an investigation by the County Animal Control Office into the conditions and treatment of animals on Mr. Lawson's property, past and present. If evidence of abuse is found, appropriate charges will be filed. Furthermore, I am issuing a restraining order prohibiting Mr. Lawson from approaching Thunder or Bellamy Ranch for a period of no less than 1 year, pending the outcome of that investigation." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Lawson stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, but his attorney pulled him back down. James felt tears stinging his eyes, a release of tension so profound that his whole body began to shake. Marcus gripped his shoulder, his own relief evident in the gesture. Patricia allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Judge Rivera wasn't done. She looked directly at James now, her stern expression softening slightly. "Mr. Sullivan, your testimony today was compelling. The work you've done with Thunder demonstrates not only skill, but compassion and understanding of animal trauma that should be recognized." While I cannot make recommendations beyond the scope of this case, I would encourage you to consider formalizing your training and potentially working with other animals in need of rehabilitation. She turned to address the full courtroom. Let this case serve as a reminder that how we treat animals, especially those in our power, reflects our values as a society. Ownership comes with responsibility, and that responsibility includes providing proper care and protection from harm. This preliminary ruling stands. Thunder remains the legal property of Marcus Bellamy. Case dismissed. The gavel came down with a decisive crack, and suddenly James was being pulled into embraces by Marcus, by Patricia, by Mrs. Chen, who had somehow made her way to the front of the courtroom. People were cheering, crying, clapping. Through it all, James could only think of one thing. He needed to get back to Thunder, to tell the horse that he was safe, that they had won, that no one could take him away now. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of phone calls and congratulations. Marcus fielded calls from reporters wanting statements, from supporters celebrating the victory, from other horse owners asking about James's availability to work with their difficult animals. James sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, feeling the weight of the past weeks lifting from his shoulders, but leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. When they finally pulled into the ranch, James didn't wait for the vehicle to fully stop before jumping out and heading straight for Thunder's paddock. The horse was pacing near the far fence, agitated by James's absence, by the disruption to their routine. But the moment Thunder saw him, the massive stallion stopped and released a piercing whinny that sounded almost like relief. James climbed over the fence rather than taking the time to go through the gate, and Thunder met him halfway across the paddock. The horse pressed his head against James's chest with enough force to nearly knock him backward, and James wrapped his arms around Thunder's neck, burying his face in the warm, familiar scent of horse and hay. "We won," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You're safe. You're staying here. You're mine and I'm yours, and nobody can change that now." Thunder seemed to sense the shift in James's energy, the release of the fear and tension that had colored their interactions for weeks. The horse relaxed against him, breathing deeply, and they stood like that for long minutes while the autumn sun painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. Around them, the ranch was celebrating, but in this moment, in this paddock, there was only peace. Over the following days, the reality of their victory settled in. The news of the judge's ruling spread quickly, and the story of James and Thunder took on new dimensions. Donations continued to pour in, more than enough to cover legal fees, and Marcus established a fund dedicated to animal rehabilitation at the ranch. James found himself fielding inquiries from across the state about working with traumatized horses, from establishing protocols for rescue organizations, even from academic researchers interested in studying his methods. But the most significant change was internal. James noticed that his nightmares had decreased in frequency and intensity. He was sleeping through most nights now, waking refreshed rather than exhausted. The hypervigilance that had plagued him for years had eased, not disappeared, but become manageable. Working with Thunder had given him tools for managing his own trauma, ways to calm himself that he had taught the horse and learned to apply to his own racing thoughts and panic responses. Thunder's transformation was even more remarkable. The horse that had once been too dangerous to approach now greeted visitors to his paddock with curiosity rather than aggression. Children came on field trips organized by local schools, and Thunder would stand calmly at the fence while James explained about patience and trust and healing. The stallion still had boundaries, still had moments when old fears surfaced, but he had learned that not every human meant harm, that some could be trusted. Marcus officially promoted James to Director of Equine Rehabilitation, a title that came with a real salary, benefits, and the authority to expand the program. They converted one of the unused barns into a specialized facility for traumatized horses, with padded stalls and quiet spaces designed to minimize stress. James hired 2 assistants, both veterans themselves, and began training them in his methods, in the patience and understanding required to heal rather than break. Mrs. Chen visited often, always bringing sandwiches and staying to watch James work with Thunder or the new horses that had started arriving at the ranch. One afternoon, she sat with him on the bench outside Thunder's paddock, both of them watching the stallion graze peacefully in the fading light. "You know what I think?" she said, her voice gentle with age and wisdom. "I think you and Thunder saved each other. He needed someone who understood trauma, and you needed something to believe in again. Someone who needed you." James considered her words, recognizing the truth in them. Before Thunder, he had been drifting, surviving but not living, going through motions without purpose or connection. The horse had given him a reason to fight through his own darkness, to believe that broken things could heal, that second chances were real and worth pursuing. And in return, James had given Thunder safety, patience, and the space to discover that trust was possible even after betrayal. The sun was setting now, painting everything in warm tones that made the ranch look almost ethereal. Thunder finished grazing and walked over to where James sat, lowering his head to receive the ear scratch that had become part of their evening ritual. His dark eyes, once filled with fear and fury, now reflected something softer, something that looked remarkably like contentment. James scratched behind the horse's ears, feeling the solid warmth of him, the living proof that healing was not just possible but tangible. "We're going to be okay, aren't we, boy?" James said softly, more to himself than to Thunder. "Both of us. We're going to be just fine." Thunder's response was to lean into the touch, a simple gesture that confirmed what James already knew. They had found each other at exactly the right moment, 2 souls damaged by their pasts, but determined to build better futures. And together, they were doing exactly that. 6 months after the court victory, Bellamy Ranch had transformed into something Marcus had never imagined when he first bought the property. The new rehabilitation barn housed 8 horses now, each one with its own story of trauma and abandonment, each one receiving the patient, compassionate care that James had pioneered with Thunder. The waiting list for placement had grown to over 30 animals, and inquiries came in daily from across the country. James stood in the main arena on a crisp spring morning, watching as one of his assistants, a young veteran named Miguel, who had found his way to the ranch through the same news story that had started everything, worked with a mare who had been rescued from a hoarding situation. Miguel was using the same techniques James had developed, the same patience and understanding, and the mare was responding. It was progress measured in small increments, in moments of trust built slowly and carefully, but it was real and it mattered. Thunder had become an unlikely ambassador for the program. The massive gray stallion, once too dangerous for anyone to approach, now participated in demonstrations and educational sessions. James would bring groups of students, veterans, or other horse owners to Thunder's paddock, and the horse would stand calmly while James explained the principles of trauma-informed animal care. Sometimes Thunder would even approach the fence on his own, seeking the gentle touches of visitors who had learned to move slowly and speak softly. But Thunder's most important role had emerged organically, something James hadn't planned, but recognized as profound when it started happening. Other traumatized horses seemed to calm in Thunder's presence. When a new rescue arrived at the ranch, terrified and aggressive, James discovered that placing them in an adjacent paddock to Thunder helped. The horses would watch Thunder, would see his calmness and begin to mirror it, as if the big stallion was teaching them that this place was different, that safety was possible here. One particular morning brought a case that tested everything James had learned. A call came from the county animal control about a stallion they had seized from a fighting ring, a horse that had been deliberately brutalized to make him aggressive for illegal gambling purposes. The horse, which they had temporarily named Diablo, had attacked 3 handlers and was scheduled for euthanasia because no facility would take him. James took the call in his small office, now filled with certificates, photos of success stories, and letters from people whose lives had been touched by Thunder's story. As he listened to the description of Diablo's condition and behavior, he felt a familiar pull, the same instinct that had drawn him to Thunder. "This is what we do," he told the officer. "Bring him here, we'll try." Marcus, who had been standing in the doorway, raised an eyebrow when James hung up. "You sure about this one?" "Sounds even worse than Thunder was." James nodded, thinking about the horse who was grazing peacefully outside, the horse everyone had given up on, the horse who had saved his life as much as he had saved Thunder's. "If we don't try, who will? Besides, I think Thunder might be able to help. He's been through the worst, and he came out the other side. Maybe he can show this new horse that it's possible." When Diablo arrived 2 days later, the scene was chaos. It took 4 handlers just to unload him from the reinforced trailer, and even then, the horse was fighting every step, eyes rolling white with terror and rage, his body covered in scars that told a story of systematic cruelty. They managed to get him into the specially prepared paddock next to Thunder's, and everyone retreated quickly, giving the traumatized stallion space. James stood at a safe distance, watching Diablo pace and kick at the fence, listening to the sounds of fury and fear that he recognized so well. But he also watched Thunder, who had come to his own fence line and was observing the new arrival with what seemed like understanding. The big gray horse stood calmly, not reacting to Diablo's aggression, just present and peaceful, a living example of what healing looked like. Over the next weeks, James worked with Diablo using every technique he had learned, every insight he had gained from Thunder. It was harder this time, the progress slower, the setbacks more frequent. There were days when James questioned whether they could reach this horse, whether some damage was too deep to heal. But then he would look at Thunder, remember where they had started, and find the patience to try again. And Thunder, remarkable Thunder, stood vigil in the neighboring paddock. Diablo began to notice him, began to see that this other horse was not threatened by humans, was not constantly defensive, was actually content. Slowly, incrementally, Diablo's pacing decreased. His aggressive charges toward the fence became less frequent. He started to watch James the way he watched Thunder, with curiosity beginning to override fear. The breakthrough came on a morning when James arrived to find Diablo and Thunder standing on opposite sides of their shared fence, touching noses through the bars. It was a simple gesture, one horse greeting another, but it represented something profound. Diablo had chosen connection over isolation, had reached out to another being, had taken the first step toward trust. James felt tears streaming down his face as he watched, understanding that Thunder was doing for Diablo what James had done for Thunder, offering the possibility of healing through patient presence and unconditional acceptance. 3 months later, a ceremony was held at the ranch to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the rehabilitation program. The local media attended, along with representatives from veterans organizations, animal welfare groups, and the families of horses who had been helped. Marcus gave a speech about the unexpected directions life sometimes takes, about how a desperate attempt to save one dangerous horse had turned into a mission that was changing lives across the region. But the highlight of the event was James's demonstration with Thunder. They entered the main arena together, James walking beside the horse without a lead rope, both of them moving in perfect harmony. The crowd fell silent as James spoke about their journey, about finding each other when both were broken, about learning that healing was possible when you had someone who understood your pain. Then James did something he had never done publicly before. He stepped back from Thunder and simply stood in the center of the arena, his arms at his sides, vulnerable and open. Thunder stood about 20 feet away, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then the big gray stallion began to walk toward James, not because he was called or commanded, but because he chose to. When Thunder reached him, the horse lowered his head and pressed it against James's chest, their signature gesture of trust and affection. The crowd erupted in applause, but James barely heard it. He was focused on Thunder, on the weight of the horse's head against him, on the steady breathing that matched his own. This moment, this connection, was everything they had worked for. It was proof that broken things could heal, that second chances were real, that love and patience could overcome even the deepest trauma. As the sun set that evening, James and Thunder stood together in their paddock one last time before night fell. James leaned against the fence and Thunder stood beside him, both of them watching the colors fade from the sky. In the neighboring paddocks, other horses were settling in for the night, each one a story of survival, each one finding their own path to healing. "You know what the best part is, Thunder?" James said quietly, his hand resting on the horse's neck. "We get to do this again tomorrow. We get to wake up and try again, to help another horse, to prove that giving up is never the only option." The horse nickered softly, a sound of contentment that James had learned to recognize as Thunder's version of agreement. As darkness settled over the ranch, James headed back to his room, no longer the space above the stable, but a small house Marcus had built for him on the property. It had a porch where he could sit in the evenings, a real kitchen, a bedroom where the nightmares had become rare visitors rather than nightly torments. It was home, something James had thought he might never have again. Before going inside, he turned back one more time to look at Thunder, visible in the moonlight as a silver shadow in the paddock. The horse had his head down, grazing peacefully, completely relaxed in a way that would have been impossible a year ago. And James realized that this right here was what redemption looked like. Not a dramatic transformation or a single moment of triumph, but the quiet accumulation of better days, of trust rebuilt, of two beings who had saved each other simply by refusing to give up. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new horses who needed help, new moments when patience would be tested. But James was ready for that. He had learned from the best teacher possible that healing was not a destination but a journey, that broken didn't mean worthless, and that sometimes the most unlikely friendships become the ones that matter most. Thunder had taught him all of that and more, and James would spend the rest of his life honoring that lesson by giving other broken souls the same chance they had given each other, the chance to heal, the chance to trust again, the chance to prove that even after the worst has happened, there is still hope, still possibility, still life worth living. And that, James thought as he finally went inside, was a gift beyond measure.